Today, we are diving deep into one of the most brilliant and sneaky policies in the history of British India. It's called the Subsidiary Alliance. Now, on the surface, it looked like a hand of friendship, a promise of safety. But in reality, it was a masterfully designed trap that brought Indian states to their knees and massively expanded the British Empire, all thanks to the ambition of one man, Lord Wellesley.
So let's get right to the big question here. Was the Subsidiary Alliance a real offer of protection during some very chaotic times, or was it something way more calculated, a perfect trap designed to conquer entire kingdoms without ever having to fire a shot? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together.
So here's how the deal was pitched. Imagine you're an Indian ruler. The British East India Company comes to you with what sounds like an amazing offer. Listen, we'll protect you and your kingdom from all your enemies. And don't worry, we won't get involved in your day-to-day business. In a time of constant conflict, that probably sounds pretty good, right? But the devil, as they always say, is in the details. And those details came in the form of some very specific conditions. And this brings us to the real price of this so-called protection. Let's break down exactly what an Indian ruler had to sign up for, because this is where that friendly offer starts to look a whole lot more like a cage. Okay, check out how each one of these conditions just chipped away at a kingdom's independence. First, you had to let British troops be stationed in your land, and you had to pay for them. This subsidy was so incredibly expensive that many rulers had to give away huge chunks of their own territory just to pay the bill. Second, a British resident would come to live in your court. His job was to advise, but really he was a spy and a puppet master, influencing who would be the next king and sending reports back to the company. So much for not interfering, right? Third, you completely lost control of your foreign policy. No more making deals, no more treaties, not even talking to your neighbors without a green light from the British. And finally, the last nail in the coffin. You had to fire any other Europeans working for you. This was a direct shot at their main rivals, the French. So with just these 4 steps, a ruler's power wasn't just limited, it was totally dismantled. Now, while this was an absolute disaster for the Indian rulers, if you flip the coin and look at it from the British side, it was a complete masterstroke. Let's dig into why this policy was the perfect blueprint for building an empire on someone else's dime. And you can see the genius of it right here. The British got a huge modern army that was paid for entirely by Indian money. Their troops were now positioned in key strategic spots all over India, not just in their own little pockets of territory. They kicked the French out of the game completely, and by controlling every state's foreign policy, they made sure that the Indian rulers could never, ever team up against them. They basically divided and conquered, but they did it with paperwork instead of just armies. But here's a cool little historical fact for you. Wellesley didn't actually invent this whole strategy himself. The original idea came from his French rival, Dupleix, who was the first to lend European troops to Indian rulers to gain power. Other British leaders like Robert Clive used this trick later on, but it was Wellesley who took that basic idea and turned it into the super effective 4-point weapon that we're talking about.
All right, so we get the what and the why, but now let's get to the how. How did Wellesley actually implement this policy with such brutal efficiency all across India?
Well, he had a very simple 3-step playbook. Step 1, he'd create a sense of panic. He'd go to a ruler and warn him about all these supposed plots and attacks coming from his neighbors. If that didn't work, he'd move on to step 2, direct threats. He'd basically say, sign the alliance or our army's coming for you. And if the ruler still refused, well, that's step 3. He'd declare war, defeat the ruler in battle, and then force them to sign the exact same treaty they had just said no to. It was an offer they literally could not refuse. And you can just watch this method knock over kingdoms like dominoes. In 1798, the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was genuinely scared of his neighbors, became the first to sign. The very next year, after Tipu Sultan was defeated, Mysore was forced into it. By 1801, states like Awadh were strong-armed into this new, much harsher deal. And then, the British turned their attention to the biggest power on the subcontinent, the Marathas. Now, at this time, the Marathas were the most powerful force in India, no question. But they had one huge weakness. They were a confederation of different chiefs who were always bickering and fighting with each other. The British saw this and exploited it perfectly. In 1802, after one Maratha chief defeated another, the loser, Peshwa Baji Rao II, literally ran to the British for help and signed away his independence. This made the other chiefs furious, which led to another war, and one by one, they were all defeated and forced to sign their own treaties. The most powerful force in India was just taken apart from the inside. So after this whole campaign of what was basically diplomatic bullying, what was the end result? Let's look at the long-term damage and how this whole policy laid the groundwork for the British Raj. The difference is just black and white. On one side, you have the Indian states. They were left with no armies, totally broke from paying those subsidies, cut off from their allies, and in the end, completely powerless. On the other side, the East India Company was now the top dog, the undisputed #1 power. They had the biggest army, insane amounts of wealth flowing in from these states, and a single united empire. And the sheer scale of this takeover is it's breathtaking. With this one policy, the East India Company gained direct or indirect control over nearly 80% of the entire Indian subcontinent. Think about that for a second. And that really gets to the tragic irony at the heart of the whole story. These Indian rulers, they signed these treaties because they were looking for security. They wanted protection from their enemies. But in trying to secure their thrones, they lost everything. They lost their armies, their money, and their freedom. The policy just hollowed out their kingdoms from the inside, leaving them as kings in name only. Historians often put it this way. Wellesley laid the foundation. He built the system of control, and he made sure that no one could ever unite against the British. It was another guy, Lord Dalhousie, who would come along later and finish building the house, so to speak. But the entire blueprint, that was all Wellesley. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. Can a nation really be conquered without a single, epic, final battle? Can it be done with a series of treaties, 1,000 political paper cuts, and a perfectly disguised offer of friendship? Looking at the Subsidiary Alliance, the answer seems to be a loud and clear yes.